This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Well, hello, and thank you all for coming out on a cold evening. If those of you in the back are willing to come a little forward, that will be great, and at some point we might rearrange chairs differently, but we have a small enough group, I'll feel like I'm speaking to friends if you are willing to come up a little closer. So, I actually gave my first presentation here at the library before I even lived here, so the Metaphysical Library has been a very good friend to me in my time here in Ashland, so I feel it's one of the great resources in the community. So there's a few faces here I know and a lot of faces I don't know, so I want to get a few show of hands before I jump in. I am a fairly interactional sharer, and I want to shape this according to the interest of the people who are here, and I don't really know altogether what your background is. So how many people here have some experience through actually participating in the Hellinger Constellation work? Anyone? Okay. And how many people haven't participated in a constellation but have heard about it and it interests you? Okay. And some of you didn't raise your hand for either. Have you come specifically for the ancestral interest? How many show of hands on that? Okay. All right. Well, I can get by with quite a bit then in terms of weaving in what I've shared before. So I thought I'd start tonight. I'm going to share a little bit about my own personal journey, about how I come to actually be sitting in a chair talking about ancestral wisdom in the human heart, which, especially the ancestral part, isn't something I would have expected in my life, but my life has had a lot of unexpected turns. Does anyone else relate to that your life hasn't gone the way you would have imagined? I never would have imagined talking about the ancestors. So I want to tell you a little bit about how I come to do that. And then I'll try to share some of the insights that the Hellinger work has opened up to me in terms of ancestral wisdom. And I specifically want to have a little section where I talk about the heart and kind of honor the heart as an organ of perception. And then we'll see if all of that somehow weaves together. And after the break, I'm planning on it being more experiential, whether we actually set a constellation or do a meditation. I'm not really sure yet, but we'll see how it goes. So if at any point things aren't making sense, you can kind of wave your finger and let me know. So some of you have heard this story, but I hope you won't mind hearing it again. I've been on the spiritual path for many, many years, and have been a spiritual teacher, and really felt in touch with a lot of inner resources and a sense of support. But it had never really crossed my awareness around the issue of ancestral support. So I grew up in Iowa, and we didn't think in terms of ancestors. And it was only when I moved to Chicago, which is a very ethnic-aware city, everyone wanted to know what my background was, and I never knew what to say initially. And then I figured out that if I said I was Irish, my husband said he was German, everyone was happy. So that was my first kind of step into that. And I'm going to show you a short movie clip from the movie Amistad. And when you see it, I saw the movie when it came out in the theaters about 10 or 12 years ago. And it was my first time of ever being struck by the possibility that you could call on your ancestors for help. And so I'm going to share that clip in a minute. And what that opened up for me then, kind of unconsciously was that question, wow, how would that feel to be able to call on your ancestors for help? And eventually, as the universe works, several years down the road, two things happened. What happened immediately, almost months within seeing the movie, is I made my first trip to Britain, which is where all my ancestry lies. And just going to the place of my ancestors seemed to awaken and start a process of connection. And then eventually I was introduced to the Bert Hellinger Family Constellation work, which I'll be telling you more about as we go along. And through that work, the reality of feeling the ancestors pouring through a sense of blessing and a flow of love and goodwill is really opened up for me. And gradually, I've, like many of you, I've had a deep love for this planet and a deep desire to find a way to live on the planet in a more happy way, both for the planet and for ourselves. And gradually over time, I started to realize that the ancestors hold in trust a knowledge of the land and a time of living on the land in a different way, and that's part of the blessing and the awareness that they have to offer us. And so I'll try to explore that idea a little more as we go along. But Bruce, why don't you get the DVD part ready? I think I'll show you this particular clip, and then we'll continue from there. So real quickly, how many people have seen the movie Amistad? Anyone? Okay, so you might remember it's a Steven Spielberg film. It's based on a true story about a slave ship where there was a slave uprising, but they were kind of lost at sea, so they were recaptured, and they were taken to New England and held in jail, and it became a very controversial case whether they were property and therefore to be sold into slavery, or whether they were free men and therefore to be returned to Africa. And it was argued in the lower courts and the appellate courts and the district court, and eventually was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And so what the clip I'm going to show you is towards the end of the movie. They've been through this whole process. The attorney who's been representing them realizes that he doesn't have the skill to take it all the way to the Supreme Court. So they approach ex-President John Quincy Adams, who was the 5th president of the U.S., and he's retired, he's an old man, he basically doesn't want to be bothered. But they introduce him to the African man who's become kind of the leader for the captured Africans. And they have a rapport, and so John Quincy Adams agrees to take the case. And the clip I'm going to show you is where John Quincy Adams, right before the court case, is trying to prepare Cinque, the African man, for the fact that they might very well lose the case, that it's a difficult case and they might lose. And that's the scene at which we're going to pick up. And then there'll be a very short little blank space, and then you'll see Anthony Hopkins playing John Quincy Adams arguing the case before the Supreme Court. So those are the two clips.
I'm being honest with you. Anything less would be disrespectful. I'm telling you, I'm preparing you. I suppose I'm explaining to you that the test ahead of us is an exceptionally difficult one.
We won't be going in there alone.
Alone, indeed not. No, we have right at our side. We have righteousness at our side. We have Mr. Baldwin over there.
I met my ancestors. I will call into the past, far back to the beginning of time, and beg them to come and help me. At the judgment,
Tautavala.
I will reach back and draw them into me, and they must come. For at this moment I am the whole reason they have existed at all.
The other night I was talking with my friend Sinke. He was over at my place and we were out in the greenhouse together. And he was explaining to me how when a member of the Mende, this is people, how when a member of the Mende encounters a situation where there appears no hope at all, he invokes his ancestors. Tradition. See, the Mende believe that if one can summon the spirit of one's ancestors, then they have never left. And the wisdom and strength they fathered and inspired will come to his aid. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, we have long resisted asking you for guidance. Perhaps we have feared in doing so we might acknowledge that our individuality, which we so revere, is not entirely our own. Perhaps we have feared an appeal to you might be taken for weakness. But we have come to understand, finally, that this is not so. We understand now. We've been made to understand. And to embrace the understanding that who we are is who we were.
So that was a movie moment that had a huge impact on me. I can still remember sitting in the theater, seeing that for the first time with my son next to me. And so, in a certain sense, my coming to speak tonight on ancestral wisdom is, a further evolution from that moment in the theater. How many people here have a sense of ancestral awareness? Okay. That's good. Do you have the sense of calling on them for help? Okay. It seems like a larger than usual percentage of people do. So before I had this sense of the ancestors as a source of blessing, and before I had an understanding of the quote that I used in the description, that the well-being of the living is dependent on the dead, and the peace of the dead is dependent on the living. This is a reciprocal relationship of blessing that the Hellinger work gives rise to. And that's how, when I first was introduced to the Hellinger work, what I understood about it was what a powerful means it was to helping to resolve and look at issues that have been passed from generation to generation. Okay? So that's the notion of entanglement in family issues. And how many people here are familiar with the term entanglement? I really am not Okay, most people are. So one of the insights of the originator of the Hellinger work was realizing that if you access the field of energy that surrounds various issues, it gives you direct information about the pattern of that issue, okay? And you begin to see how later family members are being affected by things that happened in earlier generations without them knowing anything directly about it. But they've become entangled in that fate. And so the constellations initially seemed somewhat like a form of family therapy, even though it was made clear to me that it wasn't therapy. And it was only over time that I realized that it didn't have to do with therapy so much as opening this flow of blessing. And I feel like I'm struggling for where the thread is here. Just give me a moment to sit with this. You know what I would like to do? Let's rearrange the chairs to be in a circle. I would really like that. Let's take a moment and do that. Thank you. Okay. You know what, I'm going to need a different. No. Can we can move out to make it big enough for everyone to come in and feel more close?
Yeah.
You know, I meditated before coming, and there was a very strong, a lot of energy work that came through. So I know there's something that's really wanting to happen tonight, and I know we can settle into it. And this will perhaps make it easier for me. I was starting to feel like I was just trying to plow ahead with a talk, which isn't really what I want to do.
I have a question.
Sure.
With regard to the various issues that more than ever are influencing and having impact on the United States as a nation, in terms of the ancestral work, do you think the founding fathers and the framers of the founding documents of this nation would be within the picture of what you're presenting tonight?
In the way in which he was drawing on it there in the film.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yes, I believe so personally. Did everyone hear the question they asked? And what that gets to is that when we talk about ancestors, there's really, in a certain sense, two types or groups of ancestors that we're talking about. A very important group is our own biological ancestry, and that's what I was pointing to initially. But there is also the question of the ancestors in terms of a more collective sense. And when you start tracing ancestry back, you realize fairly quickly those two groups can become one because the number of ancestors grows so exponentially. So that if you go, for instance, 7 generations back, you have 128 ancestors in that line. So it very quickly grows. So I can only give you a personal answer to that, but it is my personal belief and experience that yes, that's a very useful way to call on it. And I myself have ancestors that came from England to this country very early on. They were Quakers that came with William Penn And so very early ancestral input here. And so I definitely feel, I sometimes feel like, they would turn in their graves if we weren't doing something to address what's happening in the country. And it's also a good point, this notion that the ancestors, which is near and dear to me, that they hold in trust and awareness of the land. So like in this place, Ashland, where we live, in terms of honoring the ancestors, we can honor both the pioneers who settled the area, but it's also very, very important to honor the ancestors of the Takelma people, the people and the indigenous people who lived here for many, many centuries before the pioneers arrived. So it's whenever now I go into a new part of the country or a new part of the world, I have that practice and the awareness of honoring the ancestors of that place, of that locale. And it's important to acknowledge all of them, One of the principles, I'm just going to kind of follow a thread of thought here. One of the principles in the Bert Hellinger constellation work is that everyone in a family has an equal right to belong. And so when we talk about the issue of entanglements, there are certain events that are critical or most have an impact in terms of leading to entanglements. And one large one is anyone in the family who has been forgotten or excluded. And that has very challenging ramifications in the field of the family soul. And the way the entanglements work is if someone's been excluded, I have a personal friend who's Jewish and had a half-sister who died early in the events of the Holocaust events in World War II, and her mother never told her about this half-sister because she died under very painful circumstances and they were trying to put it behind them. Those kinds of exclusions create very difficult dynamics because even though a later person consciously doesn't know about it, it leaves this energetic impact that they feel. And what tends to happen is then later, a later family member unconsciously identifies with this excluded person, becomes entangled in their fate, and creates a difficult circumstance for themselves. So when we set constellations, do people know just the nuts and bolts of how you set a constellation? Okay, so I should cover that really basic thing. So Bert Hellinger is a German man who developed this work that is becoming, it's very well known in Europe and is becoming more well known around the world. And he lived for many years in Africa with the Zulu people. I always mention that because many of us feel that this is actually an indigenous knowing, setting these constellations, accessing fields of energy, and understanding the soul level of the family and the ancestors. But in the West, the person who's kind of bringing it back into conscious awareness is this man named Bert Hellinger. And so when you set a constellation, whoever it is that is setting the constellation has some issue, some concern in their heart, something that they're wanting to address in their life or in their family. And so their issue becomes the doorway into the family soul. And one of the many ways in which this work differs from therapy, in therapy it's all about how did you feel when something happened, and it's a lot about emotional response around how you feel about what did or didn't happen, what you did or didn't get, how a person showed up. In this work, it's very much about factual events. And one of the handouts I have that you can pick up later if you want to, it's a handout I give to people if they come to a workshop, will spell out what are the events that tend to lead to entanglements. But one is people that have been excluded or forgotten. If a child has been given up for adoption or has died early and their memory has been kind of not talked about because it's painful, or if there's been an uncle that was a black sheep of the family, or maybe someone who was gay at a time when being gay wasn't accepted. There's all sorts of reasons and circumstances where people are excluded or forgotten. That is a situation that can lead, say, to an entanglement. So anyway, when the person is setting the constellation, they choose people to represent various people in their family and themselves. And then they simply place people in the center of the room in relationship to one another in some way. And the magic of the work, which is hard to trust until you experience it a few times, is that in doing that, what happens is that people are not play acting. People actually begin to feel the energy of the family soul. And so even though they're representing someone, they begin to feel an awareness that reflects what the family dynamic was. Does that, I mean, that's just the kind of simple nuts and bolts of it. So, and maybe after the break, we'll have the chance to experiment with that.
Question, how is that different from Virginia Satir's work? Did she do similar kind of thing?
Well, Virginia, I don't know her work really well. I know she's a family therapist and that there is psychodrama. And so exactly all the differences I'm not qualified on that side to
she
see.
She would do constellations and so forth, and I wondered what would be different.
With this constellation work, it's a soul level process, and it's not about eliciting emotions or feeling responses, which is usually what the family therapy is more geared towards. And in fact, in this work, if the person, let's say Jack, we're going to be setting the constellation, if he started to go into an interpretation, what we would call an interpretation of his father, let's say, or go into the story that would be his version of it, we cut them, I would say that's not really helpful. In other words, we cut that off at the pass. And then what we're looking for are simple, factual circumstances. Like, do you know, how many brothers and sisters, what order, were there any early deaths, was there alcoholism? There's certain events or issues that are the ones that we typically look for. And then it's really, as a facilitator, it's about being sensitive to the field of energy. It's not coming from a theory or an idea, but letting the field of energy inform the answer. So I don't know if that is an adequate answer, but...
It's okay.
Okay. I don't know if this will fit, but this is, in terms of entanglements and how they work, I mean, that Hellinger work is based on it. But I found a quote, I sometimes enjoy reading in alternative, like physics and the implications of physics, and I found a quote around entanglement that I thought people might enjoy hearing. Because it turns out this is one of those areas where the physicists are discovering certain things. So this is from a book called Entangled Minds, Extrasensory Experiences in a Quantum Reality. So in physics, they talk about entanglements, and Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, okay? So Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum theory, used the word entanglement to refer to connections between separated particles that persisted regardless of distance. These connections are instantaneous, operating outside the usual flow of time. Physicists now believe that entanglements between particles exist everywhere, all the time, and have recently found shocking evidence that it affects the wider macroscopic world that we inhabit. In other words, us, not just the little particles. Some scientists now believe that bioentanglements, quantum connections within and among living systems, will be useful in explaining the holistic properties of life itself. And then they go on to talk about twins, that if you have a twin and you shine a light in one twin's eye, that causes it to react a certain way. another twin who's in another room not having it done, their eye will tend to respond the same way. So they use that as an example of these entanglements. But what you find is that as bodies we're separate, but on the soul level, the soul is a field of energy, and there are various interpenetrating fields of energy that overlap. And on that level, the interconnections are very, very strong. And that's where this whole reciprocal relationship of that quote, that the well-being of the living depends on the dead, and the peace of the dead depends on the living. At the soul level, we're so interconnected, and there's a mutuality of how things work. Does that make sense to people? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm going to totally switch gears now, and I'm going to approach it in from a different angle, and then we'll see how this fits. I'm not really giving you a very full flavor of the Hellinger work, but if we do a constellation later, that might be as good a way as any to experience it. If people here who are familiar with the work, if you have a question or something that's been playing on your mind, feel free to ask me, because sometimes I can weave in an awareness from that. Does anyone have anything that way?
I was wondering, now, the word constellation, is that used in sort of a parallel way to the way when we look up at the starry sky, and those are those kind of constellations, and each corner, each part of the constellation, there's a sun perhaps with a solar system, but regardless,
Yeah.
a star, a shiny spot in the night sky. And each one has its role in that constellation. So is it likewise in parallel that with family, extended family, and ancestors, that each person, whether ancestor or closer relation, each has a starring role, so to speak, in the constellation? Is that what it is sort of about?
Yeah,
or?
you know, it's interesting. One of the hats I've worn in my life is as an astrologer, and I realize that people do sometimes, you know, when you say
I'm
constellation,
looking
think
for a
of it.
parallel.
I don't know why Hellinger started calling it constellations. If anyone knows, I don't know.
Or if there's
But
a
it
better
is,
word.
but it is true. So I don't know why he chose to call it constellations. I just call it because that's what, you know, it's called.
Right.
But it is true that what you look for in a constellation goes along with this idea that everyone in a family has an equal right to belong. And you can think of it as your immediate family, but as we extend it to the human family, that same insight applies. When you set a constellation, initially the family members are usually out of harmony with one another. And that is reflected in their face and their posture. They're usually, sometimes people are turned away from each other. A father might have absolutely no awareness of the children. You know, all sorts of things show up and reflect the entanglement. And an entanglement is something then that keeps the free flow of love from moving through the family system in such a way that people feel that love and support. And it cuts off the flow of the ancestral blessing. I always picture it as just like a hose that's gotten crinked, so the energy is not coming through. And what you look for, I was a soul level healer on the individual level for many years before I started doing the Hellinger work. And there's a quote from Alice Bailey, who wrote a book called Esoteric Healing, and she says the first law of healing is that all disease, and you can kind of think of it as dis-ease, is a result of an impeded soul life, and that the role of the healer is to release the soul so that its life can flow. So it's the idea that movement is life, and that the soul in its natural state is fluid and flexible and wants to move. And that's true for the family soul. And Hellinger says you trust on love. Love is the truth of our existence. Love exists in every family. But because of these entanglements, people don't often feel that love. And when you initially set a constellation, that's what you see, is you see it's as if the night sky, instead of having an orderly arrangement of the stars, they're totally out of relationship with one another or in a damaged, difficult relationship. And then what you're looking for as you're attending to the constellation, and it's not an artificial thing that you can impose, but you feel into the constellation and you look for what are the healing movements or healing statements that will allow that sense of movement to occur. And it's not a theoretical thing when you see it in the field, because suddenly the people who are in the field representing, their faces change, their bodies change, and their relationship to one another change. And when they come into their right place, one of the themes, I don't know if I did put it in the description for the talk, but one of the themes in the work that's very important is what we call the power of place. And when family members come into their right place within the family, that's when they suddenly feel supported, and they suddenly feel that sense of belonging and being in the right place and feeling the love and support. And so it is true that there is then the energy reconstellates in a way that reflects a hidden order. That's another term you'll hear in the Hellinger work, the orders of love. And it doesn't mean orders like, issue an order. It's hidden order in terms of a hidden pattern or a hidden container that allows the family members to rest or allows love to work most effectively. Does that make sense to people?
Well, I was wondering, another question is, in this regard, where, say, in a family or an extended family situation, and say a person has, like I have, wondered just how I'm viewed, what's my place in the family. I mean, I've lived away from extended family, so I don't visit as often as my sister who lives closer geographically. But even one person like myself who gets an awareness, a better understanding of, in terms of place, what you're talking about, how can I better understand my place or maybe negotiate within the family setting a way of understanding what that place is, my own place within the family?
Well, I won't try to answer for you.
No, just
individually.
generally. I want to.
But in terms, I can quickly enumerate some basic insights that come out of the work that might be useful for people in terms of the order of love. I'm going to do that very quickly, but let me say that Hellinger was very concerned that this work not be turned into a theory or a dogma. So I really want to reiterate that the main body of work comes out of setting the constellation and then attuning to that and letting the truth of what happens come out of that, each constellation, But having said that, there is a certain body of work, and you can check out books. The Metaphysical Library has a whole section on Hellinger work and has a couple copies of this book, which is the one I recommend if people want to read about the Hellinger work. I think this one is a good one to start with. It's called Acknowledging What Is.
Catherine? Could I say something here?
Sure.
On that movie, when we were watching the movie, I thought it brought out a good part about individuals versus, like, you look around and you say, well, there's 20 individuals here, 20 people, that's all I see. But really, the implications of the whole thing is there's constellation, there's a constellation. Everybody has come with their ancestors. So there's more than just this many people in front of us. There's hundreds and hundreds of people in front of us. There's people behind you. There's people that represent you. You are a constellation. And in this work, if we would want to look at your constellation and you would want to get a better idea of what is going on there, which is what you were kind of implying, we are able, by you consenting to having us look at that, we can step in to your constellation and you would be able to see it. You would be able to see these relationships. They come
Right.
very clear.
Right.
And so that's, I think, where they get the word constellation, because we each have one. There are all these constellations out there. There's hundreds of people out here right now, or with us right now.
Yeah, that's the
It really
thing, when I said a
shows
lot
up.
of energy work came through before I came, I mean, believe me, if you're sensitive to energy, if you feel in, you'll know that what he's saying is true. There's more presences in the room than just there are bodies, and hopefully we'll get to that in both a meditation and a constellation. Go ahead.
I wanted to say something along the lines of what came up earlier about constellations and how there's another definition that is on the celestial level. One of the things that happens on the celestial level about constellations is that usually there is a myth or a story that is attributed to certain formations that are called constellations in the heavens. And from one point of view, our ancestral heritage has a myth of some kind that gives purpose to our lives. And at the same time, it also tends to limit the degrees of freedom that we might have to a greater or lesser extent, depending upon how much we are invested or believe in or are structured in our lives by those myths.
It is true. I mean, part of the awareness that the ancestors bring through is they tell stories. And that's, you know, the myths point to a soul level depth of meaning. So there is a reason why traditionally the soul responds to stories and responds to myth. And Hellinger actually uses story in his work to evoke that. So I don't know if that's exactly what you were pointing to, but I know the archetypal level of myth and meaning. It's true. This work is really, for me, it's about accessing a depth in ourselves and in life that we all kind of know is there, but this work gives us a way to step in and feel it more directly and vividly. So, do you still want me to outline some of the orders of love to go back to that question? I'll try to do this quickly because then I want to switch over to the heart aspect before we take a break. So this is going to be kind of cursory, but there are different orders of love or patterns of relating that tend to allow love to flow well. And so there'll be different ones between, the ones I'm going to talk about are between parents and children. But then let's say in marriage, between man and woman in a close relationship, there would be other orders. But I'm going to talk about the four key orders of love between parent and child, okay? And the first one that is very, very important is that love works best when children take life exactly as it was given. Okay? And so this is the way, I like to relate this to the biblical, I don't know which commandment it is, but the commandment from the Bible to honor thy father and thy mother. That's how I relate to this. But this is the level of the order of love where you honor your biological mother and your biological father for having passed life on to you. And it is free of the psychological evaluation of what kind of job they did while they did it. It's simply the acknowledgement that you are only the person you are because you had these parents. And so it's an acknowledgement, and sometimes even in the work, the healing statement that's used is, you are the only parents for me. Okay? It's the simple acknowledgement that you honor them for having passed life on to you. and that you are who you are only because you've had these parents. Okay? So that's the first order of love, is if a child can take their parents exactly as they take life exactly as it was given. Okay? And then the second order of love is if the child can take what their parents give in addition to life. So the first one is literally just the DNA, like you got your DNA only through this woman and this man, okay? The second order of love is just embedded over that, that you take life as it was given, as your particular parents were able to give it. How many people here have ever seen that TV show 6 Feet Under? Anyone watch that? Well, it doesn't matter, but there's a great, I should track it down sometime, there's a great scene in there where the gay guy and his black partner are going to see the black guy's family. I forget the characters' names. And they're in therapy, right? They're going home to see their parents, and he gets in a fight with his dad. And he's really upset, and he's saying to his dad, look, I'm trying to get to the place where I can forgive you. And his father gets really angry and says, forgive me, I worked every day of my life to put food on your table, you know, and he goes, forgive. And so then they have an argument over that. Well, this, the second order of love, basically sides with the father in that issue and says that it is arrogant on a child's part to evaluate their parents and think that they're in a position to forgive their parents. So this does not deny that there's another psychological level where the whole dynamic is different, but on this soul level, love works best. The order of love works best if the child can take love and take life as the parents actually passed it to them. And a beautiful way to understand it or to think about it is, in a sense, what you do is you switch loyalty from the psychological level to this other level. You switch from a lower truth, which is what you didn't get, what you would have liked to have gotten, and you switch from that lower truth to a greater truth, which is, in most cases, you got enough that you're here. You got enough that you're sitting in the room, you know? And so it's basically, if you can simply give up the illusion or the fantasy of how you would have liked it to have been and simply take it as it was given, then actually you receive more and life works better and love works better, okay? So that's the second order of love between parent and child. The third one is a little trickier to describe, but the third one is that you respect what your parents give you personally beyond that, or what talents or abilities they have beyond that. And this gets in the order of, like, he says, for instance, say with an inheritance, you're not owed an inheritance from your parents. If you get an inheritance from your parents, that's like extra gravy, but that isn't something they owe you. And if you go to your parents and relate to your parents as if they owe you that, that sets up a difficult dynamic. It tends to close the heart and make a demand that doesn't harmonize with the order of love, okay? And the reciprocal part of that is important because you also leave to the parent what is uniquely theirs. And this is where we get back to an entanglement, because parents and children love each other at such a deep, pre-conscious, archaic level that they are willing to sacrifice for one another. And children in a family system often, through an archaic, entangled type of love, sacrifice themselves in order to try to adapt to the family system. Does that make sense to people? So people, let's say,
But that's not taking it as it is.
Exactly. It's what it is it's not a child's place to take care of a parent. See, that's not the child's place. In the order of love, what works well between parent and child is that the parent, and this is the fourth order, so I'm going to talk about them kind of together. The fourth order between parent and child is that the parent is big, the child is small. The parent gives, the child takes. That's the proper order of love that allows love to work well between parent and child. But what happens for all sorts of various reasons is that children try to make themselves bigger than their parent. They try to take care of their parent or sacrifice for their parent. And they're motivated by what he calls a mythical belief that you can save another person's from suffering by taking it on yourself. And that's a distortion of the proper order of love between a child and a parent. Do you see that? And so the third order has to do that you let the parent carry their fate. If they've had if they've had alcoholism, or if they've had a illness, or if they have an issue with their past, that's their fate to carry. And oftentimes, when you set a constellation, you see how a child has become entangled in trying to do something for a parent that is outside their proper place. And so the healing movement then is for the child to give it back to the parent, and for the parent to say, I'm big, I can handle this, I'll carry this now. Do you see that? So that's the fourth order of love that allows it to work better.
Yeah, that's strange though. To a degree, I see that part of the natural order of things is that when the parents do get old though, they decay in some way. They return to the source, and it's almost as if the natural course of things is for the child to, in some way.
Yes, well, that's a different question. That's a different question. Once the child is an adult, then the reciprocity of love. He talks about a balance of giving and taking. But between a child and a parent, like say between lovers or between husband and wife, there needs to be a reciprocity of giving and taking. And if it gets out of balance, that's outside the proper order. But between parent and child, the order is the parents give, the children take.
I see.
And you'll never be able to pay back or reciprocate what they've given you. The way you pay that back, or the way you balance that, is you give it to the next generation. You give it to your children or to other people's children. That's the way the reciprocity in that giving and taking works. Do you see what I say?
Abuse.
Even, we'll just say even, and then as an adult, then you can care for your parents. But that's very different than as a child. Do you see what I'm saying?
I understand.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's where the entanglement
That's when
comes.
the roles,
Right.
the roles shift.
Right. And then in terms of abuse, and when there's been abuse, that is definitely one of the circumstances that leads to entanglement. And so then, of course, you'd have to look at what the particular dynamics are. But even, and I don't want to get into it because we don't really have the time. He's flashing me the time. But certainly if you, you said you had some experience with the Hellinger work, and if you look into it, Hellinger has worked with people where there's been extreme abuse, and I've been in constellations and worked with constellations with that. And it varies depending on the circumstance. But even there, what would go for is you still trust in the love, and you get to the level of love, and usually you can see that everyone in the system is affected, and that sometimes, oftentimes like what he says is with abuse, immediately the facilitator has to make room in their heart for the perpetrator of the abuse. And then you look to see where those entanglements are. And it's not to excuse anyone. Everyone is still responsible for their actions, even despite entanglements. But it's very important in abuse cases that, again, everyone has an equal right to belong. And oftentimes the person, not always, but a lot of times the person who's openly perpetrating the abuse, the entanglement in that issue often is in the other family line as well as that one. So again, you start to see the interconnections, okay? So that's a very brief answer to a very big area, but one that a lot of work has been done in. So do I have time to just touch on the heart, or should I save that for after the?
Sure, I'm just schedule the break slightly later, but you should, is it 5 minutes worth?
Sure, I'll make it that.
Whatever.
One thing, what you were saying earlier about paying back through procreation of the next generation.
And care for them.
Would the paying back really be as the newer saying is, paying it forward?
Well, it's the same notion.
Yeah, paying it
It
forward.
is the same notion, yeah.
I just thought I'd
Yeah.
interject that. Yeah. Thank you.
So when we come back from the break, what we're going to do is we'll do a meditation of connecting with the ancestors, and then we'll see. I don't really have a plan for whether there's a constellation, but it seems like there might be. But there'll definitely be a meditation and a chance to ask more questions. But I wanted to tie just briefly before, and maybe I can do some more when we come back, because the title was Ancestral Wisdom and the Human Heart. And while it's somewhat more surprising to me to be talking about the ancestors and ancestral wisdom, it's not at all surprising to me to be talking about the heart, and the power of the heart is something that's been near and dear to my experience and awareness for a long time. And it ties into the ancestors, because when you look at indigenous cultures, they understood that the heart was an organ of perception and that the heart had its own intelligence. They didn't see the seat of intelligence in the brain. They saw the seat of intelligence as being in the heart. And there's many reasons and ways in which I feel that it's important to emphasize and be aware of the heart. One is in these orders of love that I was just talking about, we often in the work use, well, I'm not going to go into that, forget that. Maybe I'll go into that later. I'm going to stick to my original point here. So the heart, if we just talk about it at a biological level, what do you remember from high school biology that told you that the role of the heart was? A pump. That's right. On the physical level, the heart is supposed to be a pump. But new research now, this isn't metaphysical, this is, science. They found that though the heart, the muscle of the heart, I'm not going to give you all the stats, but it can shoot the blood out at quite a distance, but they've calculated how much the heart would have to pump to actually circulate the blood through all the vessels and everything in the body, and it doesn't have that capacity, even though it has a big capacity. And now in studying it, they've realized that, we kind of imagine the blood just kind of pumping through the heart and then being forced through the veins. They say that the blood flows not through being forced through by the musculature of the heart, but that it flows like a tornado. Blood moves through the veins like a tornado in a spiral movement with a vacuum at the center. It moves without the actual musculature of the heart. And they found now that the heart works, that the heart, and there's a whole section in this book called The Secret Teachings of Plants. And this is a fabulous book. I always like to promote this book called The Secret Teachings of Plants in the Direct Perception of Nature. And, I'm going to mention another book now that I'm on a roll. There's a wonderful book called Cosmic Serpent by Jeremy Narby. And he was an anthropologist, English, and went and lived with indigenous people in Central America. And this is where drug companies go and get plants to make medicines from. And they're always asking these people, where did you get this information? Where do you know how to do this? And they always say, the plants tell us. And that doesn't compute to a Western mind, so we just kind of cancel that out. But literally, there's a communication with the plants that can occur, and this book is the story of how that redevelops that I believe many of our ancestors had. So here's the thing about the heart. There's more I could say, but I just want to read at least this much. Basically, it's the idea that the heart now, they understand to be the generator of an electromagnetic field, and that the physical body lives within the sphere of the electromagnetic field that the heart generates. And that this is true both for us as human beings as well as for the planet, that the planet generates an electromagnetic field and that the physical planet rests within that field. And I believe that that electromagnetic field is what archetypically is called the world tree. Because when you look at how the field flows, it flows in a torus. Are you familiar with the shape of a torus? It's like a donut, and the energy circulates. So our energy is circulating through the heart, up and around. And really, when you see it in a model, it looks very much like a tree, where there's a trunk and there's the branches and the roots and the energy circulating around. So a lot of these traditions where they talk about the world tree, I believe, were our ancestors portraying their understanding of these electromagnetic fields that are now being discovered. And when they talk about, a lot of times they would use like drum beats or other repetitive sound, and it would be like to bring the human heart into resonance with the earth heart rate. And so if you think of it, when I said the soul was like interpenetrating fields, it's like we have our field of energy, this electromagnetic field that our heart generates, and then it overlaps and is interpenetrated with the earth's energy field. Do you get that? And one of the things they've discovered now, they have machines where they measure the electromagnetic field. The field that the heart generates in the body is 5,000 times stronger than what the brain generates. So I think this is really important, and the brain doesn't have an inherent moral nature to it from what we can tell. It will compute any information. That's where we see, kind of the demonic, brilliant scientist. But in the heart, when you focus in and at the heart has a natural moral integrity to it. So this is, when I talk about ancestral wisdom, and part of the understanding that I feel like the ancestors are wanting to bring us back to, the importance of the heart is a big part of that. And it's actually through your own heart that you'll become aware of your ancestors and what it is they're trying to describe to you.
Do you have an idea where you want to go, or you want to maybe pick up more on the heart? Do you have... I am especially interested in opening my heart. It's a strong part of myself, but I tend to be inhibited also, and I'm close to my ancestors. I lived around them, and it seemed like I always appreciated them. There's a cerebral part of this that I notice I'm resisting, like calling on the ancestors. I don't feel the need to do that. I sort of, but I don't really know what it is.
Right.
And thinking about the bigger ancestors, it's real easy for me to tap into shame, being a white male, and what I see my ancestors have done. So I'm a little confused about that. But more personally, I'm interested in it immediately, personally, like how can I become more courageously open and vulnerable and
Well, I'll make a few comments on that, and then I want to do the promised meditation at least.
I kind of wonder, kind of dovetailing on what he's saying though, I kind of wonder if people, if they're going to call on ancestors, is it with the assumption or presumption that they are all in some way in one accord, that they're a united cheering section in a way? I mean, how is that viewed, really?
Yeah, because it's not like they're all going to have the same politics all of a sudden.
Exactly, yeah, they can all differ, and whether difference or they're in agreement somehow with each other, and they have your back, or how does that work?
Well, okay, so first off, because this is a depth work, it's really, in a sense, about honoring mystery. And years ago, I read a quote that said, "The mind creates the abyss, the heart crosses it." So again, it's not about judgments and opinions and that I'm right. Or I wanted to pick up on this issue of being ashamed,
So is that
of
more
shame.
like a moral support then?
Well, it's
Sort of.
funny when you experience it in a constellation. It's literally, you just feel this flow of blessing. I mean, it's literally that's what it feels like. It's a flow of blessing energy, and it comes freely. It's not about we bless you if you do this, or something like that. It's just a blessing, a life blessing that comes through. And on this issue of shame, and this is when I said in my description something about share my vision of calling forth the goodness of the human heart and accessing the ancestral wisdom. It's like after another, I was at a constellation workshop, and this was after having participated in many. But at a certain point, I found myself at the end of the workshop, and what I said was, I'm in awe of the human spirit. And it was a complete different feeling than how you might feel about your fellow human beings or your particular ancestors when you look at the daily news. And it was the awareness of having reached a depth, again, a soul depth, where ordinary lives were suddenly seen in a different context. So this work doesn't just honor like the heroes and heroines. It honors the ordinary life, and you penetrate through to the soul level, and you start to realize that there's a greatness of the human spirit that is expressed in simple, ordinary lives who have simply embraced their fate and done what it took to get the job done, And it awakens this whole sense of gratitude and a whole awareness of blessing and a whole, as I said, in awe-ness of the human spirit. And that's this work, I know from my own experience, has many benefits to offer individual people and individual families. And that's important because then those spread out. But part of my passion for doing this work is that awareness of how it can call forth this goodness of the human heart. And I started to say, but I thought it might be a little abstract, but in the orders of love in the work, say children bow to their parents, but parents don't bow to their children. Okay, that's because parents come first, so it's a different order. Whereas couples bow to each other. Well, when you set a collective constellation, and I started to participate in some, it's like when the earth is being represented and humanity is represented, humanity bows to the planet, but the planet does not bow to humanity, okay? The planet has primacy. The planet can survive without us. We can't survive without her. So there's a primacy there, just like the parent comes before the child, so the child is dependent on the parent. But when you put into the field not humanity, but the human heart, then the earth and the human heart bow to one another.
Why is that? Yeah, why is that?
Because, it's one of those things where when I saw it enacted in constellations, again, it wasn't something I thought up. When I saw it enacted, I realized it's a reflection of the greatness of the human heart as the human heart. And maybe it has to do with that way in which the human heart interpenetrates with the electromagnetic sphere of the earth. I don't really know. But I've seen it reflected over and over again. And so this is part of why I think there's many ways in which that's important. But years ago, I heard a speaker named Thomas Berry. Are any of you familiar with him?
Sure.
Well, he is a priest. He might still be alive, but I think he recently died. A very old man, even when I heard him. And he was a Christian priest who called himself an ecologian. And he did a lot of work to bring awareness about the Earth and the Earth's ecosphere. And he presented work at the United Nations to get the Earth represented as a, with equal rights. And he did a lot of work showing how Christian theology has been destructive to the Earth. And amazing man. And when I heard him speak years ago, one of the things he said that really stayed with me, one of those pivotal moments, is he said the main energy crisis we face on the planet is not a crisis of oil, peak oil, or, of external energy. The main crisis we face is a crisis of the human spirit. Do we have the confidence? Do we have the faith in ourselves? Do we have the courage to do what it takes to meet the challenges that we're facing? And so that was the energy crisis he was concerned with, was how do we call forth our humanity to respond? And so that question stayed with me. And gradually over the years of doing this work and learning about the heart and learning, I've realized that that moment when I said, I am in awe of the human spirit, that was the ticket. That was the way home. That's part of the power that I have seen that this work can open up. That instead of reading the daily news or, looking at the history and just feeling like, I know people literally who think we need the aliens to come and save us because, we've made such a muck of it ourselves. Well, personally, I'm not that happy about giving over planet Earth, And so this ability to tap into the depth of goodness in the human heart as a race is part of the potential of this work. And so, the details of politics and all of that, I don't know how that all plays out. But I do know that phrase, the mind creates the abyss, the heart crosses it. That at the level of the human heart, there's a tremendous capacity. And that's what we need to be drawing on. And then suddenly, these issues, you see it in a different way. You just somehow see human history. And Hellinger has talked about what he calls the movements of history. Families are impacted and get caught up in the movements of history, and that no one can resist that. No one can resist the movements of history. And when you set constellations, you see it over and over and over again, how the individual family has been impacted if they've been in war or had to leave their country, or all sorts of events have that impact. Do you see what I'm getting at here? And go ahead.
Dr. Zhivago is such a perfect example of what you're talking about.
Yes.
Dr. Zhivago.
Mm-hmm. And many others when you really get into it. But yes, that's true. Where you just... you see that the individual is so affected by the family, and the family is so affected by these collective levels. And again, they're interpenetrating fields. And certain things that are in motion, no parent, no matter how loving they are going to be able to prevent the impact of those events. But you start to see it in a different way, and you start, like in a war, I was talking to someone who does this work, and he said, well, he thought like the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. was on the right track in terms of that you honor the dead. But Abraham Lincoln had it really right. You have to honor the dead on both sides. To be, no one can be left out, right? Everyone has an equal place. And so somehow, and that's partly what forces the heart to grow. Do you see what I mean? So like when you think about the native peoples, the Takelma who lived here, everyone who lives here now, we are benefiting from their loss. So we have a reason to honor them and hold them in our heart and to acknowledge we're benefiting from their loss. But that doesn't mean that we have to go that next step and say we don't have a right to belong. Everyone has an equal right to belong. And we're all here as part of a movement of history that included Europeans coming to this country and moving west. Do you see what I'm saying? So it pushes you to a depth where you don't have to have shame about your own ancestors coming and, killing out the buffalo and all the, my ancestors came early and were part of that whole westward movement.
Well, you know about the westward.
But you can honor, do you see what I'm saying? Just one more thing. Do you see what I'm saying? It pushes to a depth of honoring of a mutuality that carves out a depth in the heart. And when you participate in constellations and other deep work over time, that's the main thing. It isn't like we're going in there like, oh, now we're going to straighten out this and straighten out that. And it's so much as it is that you're shaped, you're affected, you're impacted, and over time you realize your whole understanding and way of what you're able to carry and encompass within your own being has been enlarged. Okay, do you see that? So, okay, go ahead.
Well, a lot of times we're thinking a lot of times of how the West came about to be the way it is the Europeans moving westward and how the West was won. But we oftentimes don't have a good awareness from a Native American tribal point of view. Their point of view was how the West was lost. And that's the other side of it that needs to have the right balance.
Right.
And another thing,
I didn't witness this constellation, just to interject, but I understand that one time when Bert Hellinger was in this country, one of the collective constellations he set was he had someone representing the bison and someone representing the settlers, and the, and you actually set a constellation to address what is still in the collective psyche around the destruction of species. You know what I mean? So again, the work can be adapted to all sorts of human circumstances. The first constellation I personally ever facilitated was a collective one dealing with the collective unconscious of women and how we were still being impacted by the years of the witch hunts. And it was a very powerful constellation because, again, on the collective level, if you're born into a woman's body, you're affected by different issues. And the same if you're born into a man's body. So there's all these interpenetrating levels. And this work has the capacity to open up and give access to all of them. And again, it's not about having simple solutions or panaceas. It's about opening to that heart and soul depth and being touched and being impacted and growing in the capacity to carry and hold it all. That's my understanding of it.
One thing, too, I wanted to say, though, about you were saying about how we can't resist the movement of history.
Right.
And yet even one individual can have a great influence in that history. Take someone that was just honored yesterday, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He had a tremendous influence in history, and others like Claire Barton, who's a famous American nurse.
Yeah, I'm going to cut you off there, though. But
Great influence.
And that's true. But, I was thinking, and I'm a great admirer of Martin Luther King, but the fact is there was a whole movement. There were thousands of people. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So, I mean, it
In this case, sure, that's
Right.
right. Sure.
So it honors both. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see where on a abstract level you can have the buffalo and the Indian and kind of put yourself in their kind of space and imagine how it might have been. But where I have difficulty with the constellation work is I have very little knowledge beyond my parents. I knew my father's stepmother, but I didn't have any contact with my grandparents or beyond that, and I have no real knowledge of that. And to me, just sort of making up characters to represent them doesn't have any reality to me. It seems like a pure fiction that.
So what I have to say, which is, again, you either have your experience or you don't, but like, for instance, in that constellation, it wasn't trying to imagine what it would be as a bison. What I call the magic of the work is that everything is energy. And there are these interpenetrating energetic fields. They're not imaginary, they do exist. and for reasons that I don't understand, Hellinger didn't claim to understand it, but he says, I observe that it is so, so I make use of it, is you access the field of energy, and then the field of energy itself informs you, okay? So it isn't pretending, that's what I was trying to say, it's not play acting. It's actually feeling the space of energy and letting the awareness come from that. And it's true in individual families. A lot of times people don't know different events, and sometimes it stays unclear. Other times the information comes from the field itself, and you don't know ahead of time, but it suddenly becomes clear, and that's part of the usefulness of setting constellations. So, okay, go ahead.
So it would be the heart is the organ of perceiving these fields, not the brain.
Exactly. And that was Hellinger's concern, and even, you know, in terms of, quote, training for the work, I mean, you can read the books and understand certain orders, and there are certain gestures that are often used, like the bowing or, you know, different things. But his concern was if people are only coming from their mental understanding, then it becomes a theory that they're now trying to apply or impose on a situation. And that's not the way the work develops, it's not the way it unfolds well. That's where it really is about a listening, a being present. And that's why if you watch Hellinger work, most of it is done in silence. He does less talking than any other facilitator I know. Most facilitators, you know, there's more verbal awareness than what he has. But what you feel in him when you see him and what you feel in the work, and one reason I was able to adapt to the work so easily is I'd already done soul healing, where that's what I did. You just are present, and you simply are present and are sensitive to the energy, and then you trust the energy to tell you what needs to happen. So when I go into facilitated workshop, you know, I never know who's going to bring up what, and if I had to worry that I had to somehow figure it out, I would be paralyzed. But I know that you just show up and you're present, and you have a certain background of knowledge from past experience, of course, but mainly you just stay open to discover what does this particular constellation right here and now, what is needed. And there isn't any movement that can be imposed that will really have much value. But if you're listening to the energy and then get a sense of what it's ready for, those simplest movements release a tremendous energy and power. Does that make sense to people? So it's very much about this listening and letting, we call it letting the field inform you. And that's part of the reason why I like to bring physics in, just because in our culture we're so scientifically oriented, even though in Ashland and spiritual circles you get people that are hit beyond that. But nonetheless, that's where I like to, you know, bring some of the physics into it to help people start to wrap their head around how and why this might work. Anything else before let's do a meditation. Can we shut some of the lights off? Or?
Let's see, I'm going to need more space here.
Speaking of spirituality, I mean, you know, spiritually and psychologically, actually, but, you know, awareness is such a key thing. Just simple awareness has such power. So now for everyone, regardless of whatever your relationship with the ancestors has been before you came, and with your awareness of the heart and your awareness of the planet, it's like whatever awareness you've gleaned here is now at work within your own psyche and within your own heart. And just the simple awareness, I mean, the constellation work can greatly amplify it. And of course, as a facilitator, I hope people will want to come to the workshops or, you know, have individual sessions with me in the attunement work or whatever. But honestly, if you never do any of that, just if in your own awareness now, you're aware of having that sense of honoring or openness or curiosity, that in and of itself, that awareness will invite a movement within your soul. So. All right. So just take a moment to settle into the silence. There's been so many words and ideas. Take a moment. You can become aware of your breath. And really let yourself settle. Be aware of your legs. Be aware of your arms. Be aware of your body as a whole. And as you kind of just invite you to be willing to be sensitive to your own energy field, this electromagnetic field that the heart is generating. See if you can feel as if the main torso of the body was like the main column or trunk of a tree. The energy is circling around. That dynamic flow of energy of the torus. And if you don't feel the flow totally, just see if you can notice that your awareness doesn't stop at your skin, but extends out into the space around you. And that is the field of your soul. It isn't so much that the soul lives in the body, but the body lives in the soul. And as you feel more settled within your own energetic field and space, I invite you to be aware of your left shoulder. And just standing behind your left shoulder, be aware of your mother, and behind her, her parents, and behind your grandparents, their parents, and so on back through time. Just taking a moment to feel and acknowledge your maternal line. And as you do that, just let a tacit understanding of how much it's taken, everything that's had to transpire in order to give you the opportunity to be experiencing life and sitting in this room. Let yourself really take in the flow of the life force that comes to you through your mother's line. And just sense into your body awareness again. Sense into your physical body, into the energetic body. Just see if you notice any increase in fullness, in awareness, in presence. So you allow yourself to receive life blessing through the maternal line. And then let your awareness come to your right shoulder, and standing behind your right shoulder, acknowledge the energetic presence of your father, and behind him his parents, and behind them their parents. So you're really feeling and acknowledging your paternal line. Again, just let yourself really take in the life force that flows to you only through your father's line. So feeling that come into your being. And again, just sense into your body awareness, into the field of your soul. See if you can notice a sense of being enriched and enlivened. And take a moment to really stand tall, so to speak, even as you sit. Really take your place fully within your own being, within your own life. And as you feel yourself receiving this blessing influence that's coming through, take a moment to listen within your own heart. Whatever you may be facing in your life, whatever it is that your soul or your ancestors might be wanting to call your awareness to, just take that moment of inner listening through the heart. Now once again be aware of your legs and your feet, and follow the energy down through your legs and feet until you feel deeply anchored into the earth. And then invite into your awareness the fact that your own field of energy is completely encompassed by the energy field of the earth, by the world soul. Just see if you can relax into and feel your connection with the planet. And be sensitive, there might be a particular place on the planet where your heart and your soul are particularly drawn in this moment, and if that's so, just let your heart awareness gently encompass that place. that there's kind of a mutual embrace that occurs. And as you do that, have the sense of acknowledging the ancestors of the planet. Not just your own personal ancestors, but the wise men and the wise women who have been caretakers of the planet for many, many centuries. And let yourself acknowledge and call on their strength, on their wisdom, to infuse your own being. And let your awareness settle now more fully back into your own body, knowing that all these other interpenetrating fields of awareness are still completely present, but allowing your awareness to come back, settling into your physical body, feeling your presence in this room. Just let this be a moment of empowerment, true empowerment on the soul level. So that as you return to your daily life, you know you travel with great depth of resource available. As you feel ready, you can kind of gently let the body move and open your eyes and oh my God. On the dot. So we can stay a few minutes extra if you want, but I really want to thank you for hanging in there with me. I feel like I got off to a slow start, but we've come to a very rich space together, and I really, really appreciate your being willing to hear some of my reflections on how to call forth the goodness of the human heart. And I wish you each many, many blessings in your life and in our common endeavor of discovering how to live together on the planet more happily.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.